Seconds before signing a billion-dollar deal, a 6-year-old girl burst in and said, "That's fake." What she revealed changed everything. Grayson Reeves was a man who had long since stopped second-guessing anything. As the billionaire CEO of Rivex Technologies, he had built his empire on sharp instincts, relentless drive, and unshakable trust in his own judgment. Every deal he made was calculated, every risk measured, every handshake documented. This deal, what his team was calling the merger of the decade, had been in the works for nearly a year. It was supposed to be the final piece, the legacy-defining move that would cement his company's dominance in the industry for decades to come. Across the polished glass conference table sat Leon Walters, his oldest friend and longtime business partner. They had gone to college together, launched startups in shared basements, and grown into corporate titans side by side. If there was one person Grayson trusted without question, it was Leon. The conference room was filled with executives, attorneys, and assistants on standby. Everyone was watching. The press had been notified to prepare an embargoed release, and champagne waited chilling in the lounge just outside the door. The thick folder of legal documents sat open in front of Grayson, pristine and ready. His pen hovered over the final page. One signature, and the deal would be done. He allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. He glanced around the room, calm, confident, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Just as the pen touched the page, the door burst open with a loud clatter. Heads snapped around. A young girl, no taller than the tabletop, ran into the room. Her pink sweater was too warm for the season, her denim skirt a little wrinkled, and her blonde curls bounced as she moved. She held a folded paper in her hand and stopped at the head of the table, completely out of breath, her face flushed but determined. Security reacted instantly, moving toward her, but Grayson raised his hand to stop them. Something in the girl's eyes, fierce and unwavering, made him freeze. She stepped closer, standing directly across from him, and pointed to the folder of documents. "This paper's a fake," she said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "They're trying to trick you." The room fell into stunned silence. Some people stared at the girl in disbelief, while others glanced nervously at Leon, who blinked slowly, his jaw clenched in forced amusement. "Who let this kid in here?" Leon asked, his voice edged with annoyance. "This is not a playground." Grayson didn't move. He looked at the girl carefully, his brows drawn together not in anger, but in confusion. There was something about her. Something that made him listen. "I heard them," she continued, pointing at Leon. "He was talking to someone. They said they were gonna lie in the contract. And take your company. They said you trusted him too much." Leon started to laugh. "Grayson, really? Are we entertaining conspiracy theories from children now?" But Grayson didn't laugh. He looked down at the contract in front of him. Then back at the girl. Then, without a word, he stood up. "Stop the signing," he said. "We're not moving forward until legal goes through every line again. Get the originals. Get the drafts. I want it all reviewed. Right now." A ripple of whispers passed through the room. Leon stood up, stunned. "Grayson, come on. This is absurd." But Grayson didn't respond to him. He was still looking at the girl. "What's your name?" he asked her quietly. The girl took a deep breath. "Amber." She hesitated, then added, "My mom works here. She's a cleaner. She told me once that you used to know her. Her name's Juliana Brooks." The name hit Grayson like a wave. He hadn't heard it in 6 years. And suddenly, everything began to shift. The name Juliana Brooks hadn't crossed Grayson's mind in years, and yet now it echoed through him louder than any voice in the room. He stood there, completely still, as if the floor had tilted beneath his feet. Memories rushed back, soft and uninvited. A small apartment with books on every surface, her laughter in the kitchen, long walks in the early mornings before he was anyone important. Juliana had been with him at the very start of it all, when Rivex was just a name on a napkin and he was living off caffeine and borrowed time. Their relationship had ended quietly, without drama, as his ambition pulled him into a different orbit. He hadn't looked back, not because he didn't care, but because he had convinced himself there wasn't room for both love and success. Now, a little girl stood in front of him, repeating that name, holding a piece of paper and a truth too massive to process all at once. Amber. The child's name was Amber. And she had just accused his best friend of betraying him. There was no laughter in her voice, no hesitation. Just calm urgency, like she'd rehearsed this moment in her head 100 times before stepping into the room. Behind him, his team began murmuring, already digging into the documents. Some rushed out of the room with folders, others started tapping away at laptops. Leon hadn't moved. His arms were crossed tightly, his face unreadable, though his eyes had gone a shade darker. Grayson could see it now, the shift, the tension, the flicker of guilt hiding just beneath the surface. For years, he had believed in Leon blindly. And now, he couldn't shake the feeling that a child had seen what he hadn't. Grayson knelt down to Amber's eye level, ignoring the murmurs, ignoring the confusion around him. "Amber," he said gently, "can you tell me exactly what you heard?" She nodded, holding the paper even tighter. "I was in the hallway," she said. "Sometimes I go with my mom when she works late. I bring a book and sit by the stairs. Nobody sees me. I heard Mr. Walters talking to another man on the phone. He said you were too busy to notice the changes in the papers, and that after you signed them, the company would be theirs. He said it like it was a joke. Like you were dumb for trusting him." The words landed like punches. Each one clearer than the last, each one driving home a realization Grayson had spent years ignoring. He glanced at the documents on the table, the same ones Leon had been so eager to rush through. He had always thought the speed was a sign of confidence. Now he saw it for what it was, concealment. Grayson stood again and turned toward Leon. "Tell me that's not true," he said. His voice was quiet but sharp, like the crack of distant thunder. "Tell me she's wrong." Leon didn't answer right away. He looked around the room as if searching for a lifeline, then finally let out a breath that was almost a sneer. "She's a kid, Grayson. You're seriously putting your future in the hands of a 6-year-old? "I'm putting it in the hands of the truth," Grayson replied. The legal team returned after an hour of intense review. The head of the department, a man Grayson had trusted almost as long as he'd trusted Leon, walked back into the boardroom pale and tight-jawed. He laid a folder down in front of Grayson. "Clause 47B has been altered from the original draft," he said. "It transfers controlling interest to a separate shell company. That shell company is registered under a holding firm, owned by Leon Walters." Gasps filled the room, but Grayson didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on Leon, who now looked like he had aged 10 years in a minute. "You planned this," Grayson said, not a question but a statement. "You waited until I trusted you completely. You used our friendship." Leon raised his hands defensively. "You were distracted. You handed over control. I just took an opportunity." "You tried to take everything," Grayson said coldly. There was no shouting, no scene. Just silence, heavy and unshakable, as Leon left the room with nothing but his briefcase and whatever pride he could salvage. He didn't look back. When the door closed behind him, Grayson turned back to Amber. "Thank you," he said. "You saved me." She nodded, eyes wide but steady. Then she added, "My mom didn't want me to come. She said it wasn't my place. But I thought, if someone was going to hurt my dad, I had to say something." Grayson stared at her, stunned. He took a breath. "Your dad?" Amber blinked. "Yeah. She told me last year. She said you didn't know." But I knew I had to protect you anyway. Grayson's legs almost gave out. He lowered himself into the chair behind him slowly, trying to make sense of the impossible. Juliana had never told him. He'd had a daughter for 6 years, and never known. The betrayal from Leon was one thing, but this? This was something else entirely. Something personal. Something that had already begun to shift his entire world. He didn't feel anger. He felt the slow, aching bloom of something deeper, regret, yes, but also hope. Because the girl standing in front of him hadn't come for revenge, or money, or even recognition. She came to protect him. And now, everything had changed. Grayson didn't sleep that night. He tried. He laid in bed, staring up at the ceiling of his penthouse, the city lights casting faint shadows across the walls, but his mind refused to settle. The events of the day spun over and over in his head like an endless reel, Amber bursting through the doors, her voice full of certainty, Leon's betrayal exposed, the shock that settled into the room like dust after a bomb. But what haunted him the most was the girl's final words, "I had to protect you. You're my dad." Those words had cracked something in him wide open. He hadn't thought of fatherhood in any real sense. He had never married, never had children that he knew of. His life had always been dictated by goals, quarterly earnings, expansion strategies, power plays. He had believed there would be time later for everything else, for love, for family, for something softer. But he had left Juliana without knowing she carried something more than memories. She had been silent all these years. Not out of malice, but likely out of pride. And now he realized he hadn't just missed out on knowing a child, he had missed 6 years of moments that could never be replayed. By morning, the decision was made. He needed to see Juliana. Not in the office, not as an employer, but as a man who had questions, and a father who needed to understand what had been kept from him. He didn't call. He didn't send a car. He took his own keys and drove to the modest neighborhood where the janitorial staff lived, far from the steel and glass towers of Rivex. It was quiet, clean, humble. The kind of place that demanded hard work and quiet resilience. He knocked on the apartment door with more hesitation than he expected. When Juliana opened it, her expression froze. She had clearly not expected him. Her eyes were tired, her dark hair pulled back in a loose braid, and there was a tension in her shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights and practiced defenses. "Grayson," she said quietly. "I need to talk to you," he replied, voice low. "Please." She stepped aside, letting him in without a word. The apartment was small but cared for, worn furniture, a few children's books scattered on the floor, a modest kitchen that smelled faintly of coffee and toast. He stood awkwardly for a moment until she gestured for him to sit. Then she sat across from him at the table, her arms crossed loosely over her chest, not angry, but guarded. "I should have told you," she said before he could even ask. "I know that. I told myself every year that I should. But then every year, you were farther away from the man I remembered. And I didn't want to bring a child into your world just to be a side note." Grayson listened carefully. Her voice wasn't accusatory. It was weary, honest. She wasn't trying to manipulate him. She was just finally saying what had been buried for too long. "You should have told me anyway," he said, not unkindly. "I had a right to know. But more than that, Amber had a right to know me." Juliana nodded slowly, pain flickering across her face. "I didn't want to take anything from you. I didn't want your money, your name, your charity. I just wanted her to grow up safe. Without pressure. Without expectations. And I think, a part of me was scared. That you'd reject her. Or me. Or that you wouldn't be the man I once knew." There was silence between them, thick but not cold. Grayson reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small photo he had printed that morning, Amber in the boardroom, her eyes steady, holding that paper like it was the only shield she had. He slid it across the table. "She saved my company yesterday," he said. "She saved me. And I didn't even know her name until she shouted it." Juliana's eyes welled with tears, but she held them back. She's always been like that. Brave. Too aware for her age. "I want to know her," Grayson said. "Not as a CEO or a man doing the right thing. I want to be her father. I've already missed so much. I can't change that. But I want to be in her life, if you'll let me." It was the most vulnerable thing he'd said in years. There was no strategy, no business-like detachment in his voice. Only quiet, raw truth. Juliana looked at him for a long time. Then she stood, walked to a shelf, and picked up a crayon drawing. She handed it to him. It was a picture of a tall man holding hands with a little girl. Above their heads, the child had scrawled in uneven letters, "Me and my secret dad." Grayson stared at it for a long time, then smiled, his throat tight. "Not a secret anymore," he whispered. At that moment, Amber's voice came from the hallway. "Mom? Is he here?" She peeked around the corner, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. He knelt as she ran into the room and hugged him without waiting for permission. Her arms wrapped tightly around his neck, and for the first time in years, Grayson felt something powerful settle into place. He had a daughter. And she had already taught him more about loyalty, courage, and love than any boardroom ever could. The following weeks moved in a blur for Grayson, but not the kind he was used to. The chaos of markets, deadlines, and mergers had been replaced by something softer and far more disorienting. He was learning how to navigate a new kind of life, one that didn't revolve around boardrooms but instead began with early morning texts from Juliana reminding him to pack a lunch for Amber when he picked her up for school. It was a life that required a different kind of presence, one that demanded less authority and more humility. And for the first time in decades, Grayson wasn't the most powerful person in the room. Amber was. She had a way of commanding attention without meaning to. Whether she was asking serious questions like why some people had to work 3 jobs while others flew private jets, or laughing at cartoons in the back seat of his car, she carried herself with an intelligence that seemed too old for her 6 years. Grayson found himself fascinated by her, not just because she was his daughter, but because she challenged the way he saw the world. Her honesty was brutal, but never unkind. She asked him once if he had ever lied to get what he wanted, and when he hesitated, she simply nodded and said, "I figured. But at least you stopped." He had stopped. At least, he was trying to. Grayson also spent more time with Juliana, not because he felt obligated, but because being near her brought a sense of clarity he couldn't find anywhere else. She was grounded in a way he envied, capable of holding steady under pressure without losing herself. She didn't ask him for anything, and yet every moment they spent together gave him something money could never offer: peace, and the feeling of being known without having to explain himself. They talked late into the evenings, sometimes about Amber, sometimes about their past, and sometimes about nothing at all. She had built a quiet, strong life on her own, and he respected her more than ever for it. At the office, everything had changed. The fallout from Leon's betrayal had reached the press, and though the company had taken a hit, Grayson's response had earned him a rare kind of respect. He didn't cover it up or shift the blame, he exposed the truth, cleaned house, and rebuilt. Shareholders were wary at first, but as Grayson made bold internal changes, reorganizing leadership, introducing new ethical compliance policies, and creating a whistleblower protection program, confidence returned. Still, none of it mattered to him in the same way it once had. The power he once clung to now felt like a tool, not a prize. He used it to protect his people, to create space for those who'd never had a voice. And at the center of it all was the quiet knowledge that one little girl had saved it all. It was during one of those office days, long after the boardroom had emptied, that he found himself alone in the same conference room where Amber had first confronted him. He stood by the window, the city stretching below, and looked at the chair she had once stood beside. A place where a child had told the truth no adult dared speak. He thought about what it meant to be someone worth protecting. Someone a 6-year-old would run into a room full of strangers to defend. That image stayed with him, not as guilt, but as a calling. He wanted to become that man, not just in moments of crisis, but every day. One Friday afternoon, he arrived early to pick up Amber from school. She ran to him with her usual energy, but this time, she handed him something, an envelope, sealed with a sticker shaped like a heart. Inside was a drawing. It was the three of them, Grayson, Juliana, and Amber, standing under a big tree. Amber had written across the top in her uneven handwriting, "My real family." He swallowed the lump in his throat and knelt to hug her, but she pulled back just enough to look him in the eye and ask, "Are we gonna stay a family this time?" He didn't rush to answer. He took a deep breath, then said, "I don't know everything about being a dad. But I do know I don't want to miss another day with you. So yes, I'm staying." Amber smiled, the kind of smile that sinks into your bones and stays there. She grabbed his hand and said, "Then we're good." That night, over dinner with Juliana and Amber, Grayson looked around the table and realized something he hadn't felt in years: he didn't want to be anywhere else. Not in a meeting, not on a stage, not chasing anything more. For once, everything he needed was right in front of him. And for the first time, he truly understood what it meant to come home. The weight of fatherhood settled on Grayson in the most unexpected ways. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming all at once. Instead, it revealed itself in quiet, humbling moments that crept up on him when he least expected it. It showed up when Amber reached for his hand instinctively while crossing the street, or when she would fall asleep beside him on the couch with her head resting lightly on his shoulder and her fingers still clutching a crayon. These were the small, sacred pieces of life he had never made time for, the details that had once seemed insignificant from his office at the top of the world. Now, they meant everything. But being a father also meant facing the past, his own mistakes, his choices, and the pain they caused. One evening, after Amber had gone to sleep, Grayson and Juliana sat at her kitchen table while the city outside hummed faintly in the background. There was a tension in the air, not unpleasant, but full of the things they hadn't yet said. Grayson stared at the rim of his coffee cup before speaking. "I keep thinking," he said slowly, "about what kind of man I would have become if I had stayed. If I hadn't walked away from you." Juliana didn't respond right away. She reached for her own cup and turned it slowly in her hands, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but clear. "You would have become someone else. Maybe better. Maybe worse. But not this version of you. And maybe this version is the one Amber needs now." It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. But it was understanding. And that meant more. At the company, changes continued. Grayson was more involved than ever, but in a new way. He no longer cared about dominance or outmaneuvering competitors. He cared about sustainability, transparency, and building something worth inheriting. He launched a new initiative under Rivex called the Open Door Program, an internal platform where employees at every level, from interns to custodians, could anonymously raise ethical concerns or report exploitation. He credited the idea to Amber, although he didn't tell the board the full story. It was her voice that had cut through layers of deception. It was her courage that had exposed a billion-dollar betrayal. Grayson knew if she could see what others refused to, then so could others like her, if only they were given the chance. Meanwhile, his bond with Amber deepened. They developed rituals. Saturday mornings were pancake days, always with blueberries even if they were out of season. Every Wednesday night, they played a game where Amber would make up wild stories and Grayson had to pretend they were real and respond with a completely serious face. She loved testing his ability to stay in character, and he loved how much she laughed when he inevitably broke. For the first time in years, laughter came easily to him. Real, unguarded, sometimes messy laughter. It felt foreign and necessary at once. There was one night that stood out more than the others. Amber had a nightmare. Grayson had just gotten home from a late board meeting when he heard her crying in her room. Without hesitation, he rushed in, knelt by her bed, and wrapped her in his arms. Her little hands clung to his shirt, and she whispered, "I dreamed you disappeared." His voice cracked as he said, "I'm not going anywhere." She pulled back and looked at him. "Promise?" "I promise," he said. And for once, he meant it without conditions. Later that same week, Grayson was invited to give a keynote speech at a high-profile industry summit. The topic was listed as Legacy Leadership. It was supposed to be about business strategy, but as he stood on stage in front of hundreds of executives, investors, and media professionals, he couldn't bring himself to deliver the speech that had been written for him. Instead, he took a deep breath and began talking about Amber. He spoke about the day a 6-year-old girl walked into his boardroom and told the truth that no adult had dared to say. He spoke about how that one moment had exposed the rot hiding beneath polished surfaces, and how it had changed him more than any financial loss or success ever could. "I was building an empire," he told the room, "but I almost lost my soul in the process. She reminded me of who I used to be, and who I could still become." The room was silent. No applause. Just stillness. And then, slowly, hands began to come together. It wasn't the usual polite clapping of a business summit. It was something deeper. More human. After the event, someone from the audience came up to him, a man in his 50s who had led a Fortune 500 company for over a decade. He didn't introduce himself. He simply said, "I wish someone had stopped me before I signed certain things." And then he walked away. That night, as Grayson sat in his car looking at a photo of Amber on his phone, he realized something important. He hadn't just found his daughter. He had found himself again. Not the man who built skyscrapers and balanced numbers, but the man who could hold a child through a nightmare and promise her he wouldn't disappear. It wasn't a perfect life. But it was finally a true one. Months passed, and what had once felt like an unexpected detour in Grayson's life began to feel like the only road he was ever meant to be on. Every day brought new layers of connection, new challenges, and revelations, some beautiful, others difficult. His relationship with Amber had grown into something steady and real. She no longer hesitated before calling him Dad, and he never missed an opportunity to be there, whether it was school plays, dentist appointments, or simple walks to the park where she'd quiz him on everything from planets to why clouds changed shape. He wasn't just learning how to be a father, he was learning how to show up, to stay, to listen with the intent to understand instead of respond. In her eyes, he wasn't a CEO, he was simply hers. But not all of the changes in his life came with warmth. His decision to go public about the betrayal within his company had sparked more than just media buzz, it opened the door to a full-scale internal audit. What began as a review of Leon's contract snowballed into the discovery of layers of mismanagement, hidden expenses, and backdoor deals orchestrated by others he had once considered loyal. The depth of the corruption shook Grayson. For years, he had thought his instincts were infallible, but the evidence was overwhelming. He had been surrounded by people who benefited from his absence in the small things, people who had counted on him being too busy, too distracted, too trusting. Instead of burying the findings to protect Rivex's reputation, he made a decision that shocked the entire board. He made them public. He took responsibility for his blind spots, held those involved accountable, and restructured the leadership team from the ground up. Many questioned his judgment. Investors panicked. Stocks dipped. But Grayson didn't flinch. He had seen firsthand what happened when the truth was ignored in the name of convenience. He wouldn't let that happen again. Juliana watched all of this quietly, offering her support without stepping into the spotlight. She knew how heavy it was for him to rebuild something that had been his life's work, while simultaneously building a relationship with a daughter he'd only just begun to know. Some nights, they sat on her balcony with tea, not speaking much, just breathing through the quiet weight of everything changing around them. Other nights, he'd arrive at her door exhausted, only to be pulled into the living room by Amber, who insisted he help her finish a puzzle or read just one more chapter of a bedtime book. These small rituals became sacred. They grounded him when everything else felt uncertain. It was during this period of transformation that Grayson began planning something he hadn't spoken of yet, not with Amber, not even with Juliana. In the solitude of early mornings, long after the rest of the world had gone quiet, he began writing by hand the framework for what he would call the Amber Project. It was more than a foundation. It was a complete educational initiative designed to support and empower children from working-class families, especially those with parents in invisible roles like janitors, cafeteria workers, and maintenance staff. It would offer full scholarships, mentorship, access to creative and STEM resources, and leadership training. At the center of it all was the belief that some of the brightest, bravest voices often belonged to those no one bothered to listen to, just like Amber had once been. He poured everything into it, not as a form of redemption, but as a declaration of what he now valued. When he finally told Juliana, her eyes filled with tears, not because he was giving money or building something big, but because he had truly seen the world she and Amber had lived in for years without him. When he told Amber, she didn't quite understand all the details, but she hugged him and said, "So now other kids like me can help their dads too?" And he simply said, "Yes." The day the press release for the Amber Project went live, Grayson declined every interview. He stayed home with Amber and Juliana instead. They made popcorn, watched a movie, and stayed up late, with Amber falling asleep in the middle of the living room floor under a blanket of her drawings and paper stars. Grayson carried her to bed and lingered by her doorway a little longer than usual, listening to the sound of her breathing, memorizing the quiet rhythm of a life that had changed his forever. Outside the window, the city lights blinked on like stars of their own, and for the first time in a long while, Grayson didn't feel like he was chasing something or fixing something or fighting for control. He felt peace, not perfect or permanent, but real. And real was enough. Grayson stood backstage at the Rivex auditorium, smoothing the cuffs of his navy blazer, not out of nerves but out of habit. The hall was filled with people, employees from every department, from engineers to janitors, as well as board members, partners, and community leaders. Tonight wasn't about earnings reports or shareholder forecasts. It was the official launch event for the Amber Project, and Grayson had insisted that it not be held in a luxury venue or reserved for VIPs. He wanted it in the very building where Amber had once spoken up, the same place that had nearly become the stage for a betrayal. He wanted everyone to be reminded of how things had changed, and why. He walked onto the stage without notes, without a teleprompter. He didn't need them. He looked out at the audience and saw faces both familiar and new, but most of all, he saw Juliana sitting in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Amber was next to her, swinging her legs gently, her expression a mixture of curiosity and pride. For a moment, Grayson simply stood there and took them in. Then he spoke. He didn't begin with numbers or goals. He began with a story. He told the room about a little girl who walked into a boardroom and spoke the truth that everyone else had either missed or ignored. He told them how that girl had not only saved his company but had opened his eyes to the world outside his corner office. He shared that she was the daughter of someone most people didn't notice, and that she had become the person who changed everything. He didn't use Amber's name until the end. When he finally did, the room was silent except for the sound of people leaning forward, listening more closely. He spoke of equity, not charity, of responsibility, not guilt. He said it was time for the invisible people, the ones who cleaned the floors, fixed the wiring, restocked the supplies, and walked home after late shifts, to be recognized not just for what they did, but for who they were and who their children could become. He said the Amber Project wasn't a gift, it was a long overdue correction. An invitation to build something different, something lasting. The applause afterward was powerful, not performative. Grayson didn't bask in it. He stepped down, found Amber and Juliana, and hugged them both without a word. That night wasn't about him. It never had been. In the days that followed, applications for the project poured in. Letters arrived from parents across the country, single mothers working overnight hospital shifts, fathers balancing 3 part-time jobs, grandparents raising children while managing food insecurity. They wrote not asking for handouts, but for opportunity, for someone to believe in their kids the way Grayson had finally learned to believe in his own daughter. He read every letter personally, at night, often with Amber beside him, asking questions like, "Do they get to go to college?" or "Can I meet them someday?" She didn't see them as names on paper. She saw potential friends, people who had walked her path. And in the middle of it all, something shifted between Grayson and Juliana, not suddenly, but with the slow, quiet certainty of something real taking root. Their conversations deepened. They weren't just co-parents or friends bound by circumstance. They were slowly, cautiously becoming a family. One night, after a long day, Grayson stayed late at their apartment. Amber had already gone to bed, and he and Juliana sat on the couch, both too tired to speak. After a few minutes of silence, she rested her head on his shoulder. He didn't move. He didn't need to. That single moment said more than any confession ever could. Grayson had spent years building a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt hollow within. Now, everything was messier, less predictable, but it was also more honest. The people in his life weren't there because of what he could offer. They were there because he had finally stopped hiding behind titles and control. He had learned to listen, to trust, to love. One evening, as they were walking back from a community event together, Amber holding both of their hands between hers, she looked up and asked, "Is this what real families do?" Grayson looked down at her and asked, "What do you mean?" She shrugged. "They go places together. They help people. They eat popcorn on the couch." Juliana smiled, and Grayson squeezed Amber's hand gently. "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly what real families do." It wasn't the life Grayson had planned. It was better. And for the first time, he wasn't racing toward some future goal. He was simply present, exactly where he was supposed to be. Autumn arrived quietly, with crisp air and golden light that spilled through the windows of Grayson's home, settling over the rooms like a quiet blessing. Life had slowed, not in pace but in focus. Where once Grayson Reeves had woken each morning with his mind already racing toward boardrooms, contracts, and stock projections, he now woke to the sound of Amber's feet padding across the hallway and the smell of pancakes being made by Juliana in the kitchen. The rhythm of his life had changed completely, and yet somehow it felt more natural than anything that had come before it. The Amber project had exceeded every expectation. Within the first 3 months, over 100 children had been accepted into mentorship and scholarship tracks. Local communities began asking for partnerships. Teachers volunteered time. Parents wrote in every day, offering what little they could, time, skills, stories, to help others like them. Grayson made a decision he once never would have entertained. He stepped down as CEO of Rivex. Not because he was walking away, but because he realized he no longer needed to hold the reins of a corporate empire to make an impact. Instead, he took on a new title, founder and full-time director of the foundation that bore his daughter's name. The company he left behind didn't crumble. In fact, it thrived under new leadership, built on the ethical reforms Grayson had insisted on in his final months. Rivex became known not just for innovation but for transparency and integrity. Investors returned. Morale soared. The board, once skeptical, sent him a letter thanking him for not only saving the company, but redefining what leadership meant. But for Grayson, success no longer lived in stock prices or headlines. It lived in smaller, quieter victories. Like the first time Amber invited a new friend from her school, another project student, over for dinner, and he watched the two of them drawing side by side on the living room floor as if they'd known each other forever. Or when Juliana agreed to go away with him for the weekend, just the two of them, leaving Amber with her grandmother for the first time. They didn't travel far, just a quiet lake cabin a few hours away, but it was the first time in years Grayson had seen Juliana completely at ease, laughing without tension, sleeping without worry. Their relationship had grown stronger, not through grand gestures, but through daily trust, shared values, and the way they now faced problems together. Grayson asked her, one night as they sat watching the firelight flicker, if she ever imagined this life back when she was cleaning offices while raising Amber on her own. She shook her head slowly and replied, I didn't imagine it because I didn't think I was allowed to. Dreams like this felt too far away. But maybe they were just waiting for the right time. And still, Grayson kept learning. He learned how to braid Amber's hair, badly, at first, and then with growing confidence. He learned to sit still at school assemblies and clap loudly even when the performance made no sense. He learned to pack lunches with notes tucked inside, notes that said things like, "You're my hero," or "I'm proud of you no matter what," because he wanted her to know every single day that she was never invisible again. Then came the gala. The Amber Project's first annual gala wasn't meant to be lavish, but it turned into something extraordinary. Hosted in a local museum hall, it brought together families, volunteers, students, and donors under one roof to celebrate the year's impact. Amber had been chosen, by unanimous vote, to give the closing speech. At first, she was nervous, pacing the living room for days, practicing in front of mirrors, rewriting every paragraph. Grayson tried to coach her, but eventually, he realized all she needed was reassurance. On the night of the event, dressed in a simple white dress with pink shoes and her hair tied in a ribbon Juliana had once worn herself, Amber stood on stage and delivered a speech that made half the room cry. She talked about how it felt to be small and unheard, and how scary it was to speak up when you thought no one would believe you. She talked about her mom, and how she taught her that doing the right thing mattered even when no one was watching. Then she talked about her dad, not as a CEO, not as a famous man, but as someone who listened, who changed, and who stayed. He didn't save me, she said. I saved him. And then we saved each other. The applause lasted for several minutes. Grayson couldn't breathe for the lump in his throat. Juliana held his hand tightly the entire time. That night, on the way home, Amber fell asleep in the car, her head resting on Grayson's arm. As they pulled into the driveway, Juliana turned to him and whispered, "She's going to change the world." He smiled, looking down at the sleeping girl who had once stormed into a boardroom and exposed a truth no one else dared to see. "She already has," he said. Later that month, on a quiet Sunday morning, Grayson proposed. It wasn't dramatic. No flash mobs, no photographers. Just the three of them at home, eating breakfast in pajamas, when he pulled out a small ring and placed it beside Juliana's cup of tea. She looked at it, then at him, and laughed through her tears. Amber squealed and clapped her hands before Juliana could even say yes. But she did. She said it with joy, with relief, and with the certainty that none of them had to do life alone anymore. They didn't get a perfect ending. Life, by nature, refused to be that neat. But they got a real one. A beautiful one. One filled with laughter, healing, learning, and love. And sometimes, on quiet nights when Grayson lay in bed listening to the soft breathing of the family he never expected to have, he would close his eyes and think about that moment, the one that changed everything. A little girl. A truth no one wanted to hear. And the second chance that came when he finally chose to listen. The ending of this story isn't just satisfying, it's quietly revolutionary. It doesn't rely on dramatic twists or fairy tale perfection. Instead, it delivers something far more meaningful: growth, truth, and earned redemption. What makes it powerful is that the change in Grayson doesn't come from loss or punishment, but from choosing to listen to someone no one else would have noticed, a little girl with a big voice. The beauty of the conclusion lies in its realism. Grayson doesn't become a perfect man. He becomes an honest one. He faces the consequences of his past, he puts in the work to rebuild trust, and he finds love not as a reward, but as a result of his vulnerability. The people around him, Juliana, Amber, even the community, don't simply forgive him. They watch him become someone worthy of forgiveness. Amber, in many ways, is the heart of this story. She reminds us that courage isn't about size or age, it's about doing the right thing even when your voice trembles. And in the end, she doesn't just rescue a man, she reshapes a legacy. It's a story about the power of second chances, and how sometimes, the most unexpected people can lead us back to who we were always meant to be. The final scenes are quiet, but they echo with everything the characters have earned: peace, connection, and a future built on something real.